No one asked for an explanation. They didn't need one. Everyone in the narrow alleys of Eastwell Market knew the pancake stall man. Not by name, but by the smell of golden batter, the echoing sound of a sizzling pan, and the way he bowed respectfully to every customer, even the rude ones. To most, he was just the cook, a quiet, humble man in his early 40s, wearing a plain gray apron, a folded headband, and a slight limp in his left leg. His name was Thomas Rain, but no one ever asked. No one ever needed to. He just flipped pancakes, served them hot with a soft smile, and went home quietly each night. But that peace was shattered the day Jackson Blade arrived. The moment Jackson Blade stepped into Eastwell Market, you could feel the tension in the air thicken like stale smoke. All heads turned toward him, every eye sizing him up. He was a mountain of a man, all brawn and cruel angles. Tattoos of knives running down his forearms, a sneer permanently etched onto his face, and eyes that glinted like chips of ice. It was clear where such a man belonged, behind bars. But he wasn't here for breakfast. He was here to reclaim his turf. Years ago, this market had been his domain, ruling it with an iron fist alongside his late father, Blackheart Bill Blade. They'd extorted the vendors, intimidated the shoppers, turning this place into their personal fiefdom. But Jackson had a problem. When his father died, the market went to the cops. Every crooked vendor fled, leaving him with nothing. He did 3 years in juvie hall for burglary and assault. Now, out and angry, he wanted his old life back. And since the people were still here, so were the problems. So he strolled through the stalls like he owned them, knocking over crates, shouting at vendors, daring anyone to challenge him. And when he saw Thomas sitting patiently at his pancake stall, he laughed. "You cookin' for rats, old man?" he sneered, grabbing a pancake off the griddle with the back of his hand and flinging it into the crowd. The people gasped. Vendors froze. But Thomas remained calm, his eyes steady. "Please don't do that," he said softly, not with fear, but with something deeper, something older than fear, an almost ancient weariness. Jackson shoved him back, hard, and laughed. "What you gonna do, pancake man? Throw syrup at me?" But Thomas didn't move. He just stood there, absorbing the blow, watching the pancake sail through the air and land on the cobblestones. There was something about him, a stillness in his eyes, a tightness in his stance, like a coiled spring ready to snap. But how could a small, frail man like him fight back against someone like Jackson? He couldn't. He didn't try. And that was the first mistake Jackson Blade ever made. When he thought Thomas would crumble, he surprised him. "Strength isn't loud," he said, his voice unwavering. "It doesn't need to be. But when you threaten the peace I've built, you awaken the part of me I tried to bury." Jackson didn't believe him. He thought the man was bluffing, that all this talk was just to stall for time until the cops came. So he pressed his advantage, knocking Thomas off balance with a swift kick. That's when Thomas moved. It happened so fast, the eye could barely register it. 1 second he was still, calm and steady. The next, he had grabbed Jackson's arm, not in a friendly handshake, but in a grip like iron. His fingers were twisted at an unnatural angle, his knuckles white, his eyes hard as steel. Then he did the unthinkable. He tossed Jackson clean over the counter, flipping him like a sack of potatoes. The next moment, he was crashing to the pavement, the air knocked out of his lungs. It wasn't just strength, it was control, precision, timing. It was like watching a seasoned fighter take out his opponent in a single move. Jackson lay stunned, scrambling to get his breath. The pain in his arm was unbearable, like a fire had been lit beneath his skin. But it was the look on the people's faces that truly unsettled him. Awe, disbelief, and a dawning horror. They hadn't seen it coming either. Thomas stepped over the counter, his eyes like chips of ice, his grip still tight on Jackson's arm. "I didn't choose war," he said softly, his gaze boring into Jackson. "But when war chooses you, you don't get to say no." Jackson struggled to rise, but Thomas yanked him back. "Easy," he said, his voice like gravel on stone. "It's over." Jackson wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't over, that this was just beginning. But the sight of Thomas and the glint of the blade in his hand silenced him. Fear finally washed over him, cold and sharp, and he collapsed, whimpering like a beaten dog. But Thomas didn't press his advantage. He didn't strike again. He didn't need to. The very presence of the sword, the memory of its fiery wrath, was enough to keep Jackson pinned to the ground. And then something incredible happened. Thomas lowered the sword, letting Jackson scramble away. He didn't explain himself, make excuses, or even bother to chase after Jackson. Instead, he turned back to his stall, picked up his spatula, and continued cooking pancakes as if nothing had happened. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, broken only by the sizzle of the frying pan. Finally, someone broke the silence. An old woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears. "Is that?" she stammered, pointing at the sword. "It can't be," another whispered, his face pale. Someone else spoke up, his voice shaking. "That's the sword of Emberlight." And with that, the whispers started anew, swirling and growing louder. Soon the entire market was buzzing with excited murmurs, theories, questions. But Thomas didn't answer them. He didn't even acknowledge the sword. He just kept cooking, flipping pancakes and handing them out, his face impassive. Yet everyone who took a bite that day tasted more than just batter and fruit. They tasted courage, resilience, and a quiet strength that refused to be broken. And as the days passed, the legend of the Pancake Man grew. Some saw him as a hero, others as a relic of a forgotten past. But Thomas remained unchanged, content in his simple routine. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Thomas packed up his stall. He wiped down his counter, folded his apron, and sheathed his sword, the sword of Emberlight, the very weapon that had turned the tide of countless battles long ago. Now it rested peacefully beneath his worn leather jacket. He secured his tools, preparing to close for the day. As he stepped out of the market, a lone figure stood before him. It was Inspector Hayes, a man of the law with a face etched with years of hard-nosed dealings. He'd heard the rumors about Thomas, the Pancake Man, and he wanted answers. "Do you know who I am?" Thomas asked calmly, not turning around. "Why are you here?" "I want to ask you some questions," the inspector replied, his voice low. "About your past, about the sword." Thomas sighed and nodded slightly. "Very well." He turned, meeting Hayes's gaze directly. "I am Thomas Raine," he said, his voice carrying the weight of untold stories. "And if you seek to understand who I am, you must hear the tales of a time when the world was aflame." The inspector sat down on a nearby crate, signaling for Thomas to begin. And so the Pancake Man, warrior extraordinaire, started his tale, each word weaving a new thread in the tapestry of his extraordinary life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and violet, Thomas finished his story. The inspector sat in silence for a moment, digesting the tales of valor and sacrifice. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with newfound respect. "You've lived a life most men only dream of, Thomas. Why do you hide it?" Thomas looked down at his calloused hands, a faraway look in his eyes. "I didn't hide it," he whispered. "I buried it. Long ago I traded my sword for a pan, my shield for an apron. This is my new battle, to bring peace and a hot meal to those who need it." The inspector rose, extending his hand. "Then let us help you keep the peace, Thomas," he said, his tone firm. "You fought for our city, for our people. It's the least we can do." Thomas stared at the outstretched hand, then at the setting sun. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. "Very well," he said, clasping Hayes's hand. "But no titles, no ceremonies. Just let me flip my pancakes in peace." The inspector squeezed his hand, understanding the depth of Thomas's desire for normalcy. "It'll be our little secret," he promised. Unless, of course, you don't mind the company." Thomas chuckled, a rare, hearty sound. "On the contrary," he said, glancing at the approaching night, "I find comfort in knowing I'm not alone." Together, they stood watching the last sliver of sun disappear beyond the horizon, two men united by a shared purpose, bound by the promise of a peaceful night in a city that had once burned, but was now healing, one pancake at a time.